thank you all for joining us this morning, and thank you, Stephen, Zvi, and Eric, again, for joining us on the stage. I think we're in for a really interesting conversation this morning, where we tackle some of the big issues of digital transformation and operationalizing digital strategy. I asked each of the panelists in advance to do something that now I somewhat regret because it might not have been good for your psychological well-being, but to think about one thing and to talk about one thing to kick us off that is keeping you up at night. So my apologies if you had to hit the Sominex extra hard, but we'd love to just stir the pot a bit by talking about one thing that's really on your mind these days. And Eric, since you're warmed up, why don't we start with you?
I was hoping sitting here I'd go last. Listen, I know you asked for one. I think there's two things and they're intertwined. The first is around culture, because culture is driving a bunch of things. But I think from my perspective, what I've seen is moving the developer community up the evolutionary path to going from where we are today to where we want to be, which is, cloud first, mobile first, all that stuff, is a lot bigger challenge than I would have thought it would have been. And again, I've got a perspective because I run infrastructure, but for years I've said this is not an infrastructure problem. It's really around how do we change the developer community so that they're developing with the right tools, with the right mindset and the right architecture so that they don't care where they go. And that has, and again, this is not a Cigna specific thing. I've seen it at Capital and I've seen it at other places, is that's a hard change. Especially because what I talked about, which is we spent so many years outsourcing a lot of that talent that now as we are growing that talent or bringing in new talent, we've got to change the mindset.
All right, great, that's a terrific stage setter. Zvi Gal, Morgan Stanley, thank you for joining us. What's keeping you up at night?
So we look at the economy where it is now. We look at it in the next few years. We think that we are up for a slowdown. We hope it's not going to be a recession, but we definitely expect it to slow. And yet, we need to deal with an environment where our internal clients want to invest more. They expect to deliver more. The external clients have a lot of requirements and needs. So there is a dichotomy between between the expectations and the needs to provide and our ability, financial ability in order to actually do that. So we're looking for alternatives to be, again, faster, quicker, do it cheaper, and yet be innovative and be ahead of the competition. It's not that easy. There are several new religions that are coming, some that are old religions that have been reborn, agile, DevOps, etc. Of course, will provide solution to everything from world peace to hunger and cure for cancer. All you need to do is just start and everything will be resolved. And the reality is that it's not that simple. So the key or the big challenge for us is to actually utilize new technologies, provide the ability for our business to continue to grow and be competitive in a increasingly competitive market, and yet do it in a way that is manageable from a cost and capacity perspective.
So you're taking the prescription sleeping pills in that case. Stephen Davey from Societe Generale, what's on your mind? What's keeping you up?
So I think when we talk about digital transformation and expanding the digital ecosystem, for me it's cybersecurity. Specifically when I think about vulnerability management and as we move out into the edge, the actual, what is becoming a necessity of almost real-time inventory, assessing the risk, and then remediating the risk, and continuing that the next day and the next day. It's just a massive challenge, and I think the more, as I said, that we expand into our digital ecosystem, especially push out to the edge, that just becomes more and more of a bigger challenge.
Great, and we're going to dig into cybersecurity in a little bit more detail. and as we move forward. And perfect timing, it's Don Duay from McKinsey. Thank you for joining our stage. So what's keeping you up at night?
Listening to the other panelists, I would agree. I think that, the thing that worries me the most is about this aspect of how are we ensuring, as we move at such a rapid pace through this enormous, period of change in technology, that how are we managing those risks, whether it be cyber security risks, whether it be risks around trust with our clients and our customers and data, how are we going to make that all come together in a way that's actually going to work? And what does it require us to begin to rethink? Obviously digital governance, aspects of how we can ensure that we can build a more federated culture and accountability. But it just feels like that is the biggest challenge that industry and certainly business is going to have, because it's not okay to create a lot of issues with technology. It's okay to create great outcomes, but how do you navigate through that is the top of mind issue.
So thank you. You four effectively have teased out the agenda for the rest of our conversation. So in other words, it's everything, right? But we kind of get that about where we are, right, in digital transformation. There isn't one issue. You can't separate them. But I'm going to do my best to kind of bucket or identify a few key buckets for us to explore together. And Don, we'll stay with you as we move forward. And I think you've got you among the panelists have the ability to look at this lens through a couple of different organizations in the recent past. So if it comes down to it, if you're forced to say the bigger problem is technology or the bigger challenge is culture, which is it?
So, I was at Goldman Sachs for 28 years, and I think, during that period, one thing was very true, and I think it was Peter Drucker who kind of owns this quote, but culture eats innovation for breakfast, right? And so I think that aligning within the culture of the institution or was ultimately essential in helping us drive the kind of things that we did that we were the most proud of, the way that we were able to innovate and change from a business perspective. So I think culture will win over time. And I think the challenge that we had there was how do you really, not remake your culture, because obviously, there's going to be very important aspects of all cultures, but how do you really begin to ensure that it's tuned in a way that facilitates for these types of outcomes that are digital? And that means the ability to ensure that people, are comfortable with change, that people are able to bring ideas to the table and much more of a bottoms-up basis versus top-down basis. These are things that we really looked at, but culture was essential, as was really driving the incentives and how you actually processed your own business that enabled that culture to actually flourish.
Yeah, great. Eric, we'll just come right back down the line. You touched on a couple of these things in your presentation.
What he said. No, listen, it's culture at many levels, right? We think about company culture, and that's a factor, but it's also the culture within the technology community. It's the subcultures that go within each organization, and that idea of how do you change something you can't see, right? Like technology, my experience, having worked in product development for years and in IT for years, is we've got a lot of smart people, and I've never seen us not be able to overcome a technology problem, but I've always seen us run aground when we trip over a cultural problem, right? Mm-hmm. And we're living that now, because we've brought together two huge organizations that, while the cultures are similar, there's nuances that are different. And we tend to want to gloss over that because we're like, hey, we're all aligned this way and all that stuff, but you get into the nitty-gritty details of this subculture and that subculture, and there's conflict. And that is always going to drive, it's not just breakfast, it'll eat lunch, dinner, and dessert too, right? Is culture will drive your success or your failure. And I think technology, and I'm a technologist, is a far second or third to that.
Yeah. So a follow-up in that case, I think that's a really interesting observation. As we think about, we won't call it transformation, we'll call it tuning of culture, right? Relative to the challenges of digital. To hear you describe it, a kind of top-down approach isn't going to work alone. Is that a fair inference? I said to hear your description, organizations that go at cultural change as kind of a top-down, with a top-down approach, aren't necessarily going to succeed. At least that's what I'm inferring from what you're saying.
I mean, again, and so background, I grew up on the industrial side of GE, and then I moved to the financial services side. And we hated the financial services guys when I was in the industrial side, because they spent all this money, went to all these great parties, and we got none of that, right? And what was neat was, overall, there was an overall company culture, but there's a subculture within each of those sides. And then it was, even on the industrial side, is if you met someone, say, from aircraft engines, you weren't accepted there until you'd worked in engines for 20 years, right? On the capital side, if you were a lending person, you behaved a certain way versus someone who is in leasing, right? And there's all those subcultures. Now we've got Signet and we're bringing together Express Scripts. There's a lot of things we do in common. From a top down, I would say we are so focused on the customer and patient, like there's no debate about that. You talk to anybody across the company, 74,000 people, we believe that, but then, and we follow that, but then there's nuances of, certain groups behave a certain way and there's a certain culture, and how do you work through that? Because the top-down approach doesn't work. It's got to be individual.
Zvi, does this resonate with you? Are you seeing something similar at Morgan Stanley?
To a degree, yes. But I would say that still, it may not be top-down, but the behavior at the top does affect the people across the organization. If the people in the top say one thing and behave differently, that's not good. People hear it and listen. If someone is on the outside, we are all together, collegial, kumbaya, etc., and in internal meeting says, I hate those guys.
That's right, absolutely,
and those sons of bitches, etc., then it doesn't go so well. You need to be true to yourself and you need to be consistent. And if you do that, then the top-down culture is very effective. It does not come instead of the grassroots. It doesn't come instead of people, behaving the ways that they would like to be. But I think that if you keep the spirit from the top and you be truthful to this and don't have two faces, then you can affect the culture in a very positive way that way. So I will not just cancel the top-down, say it doesn't work. I think it should work in addition to other mechanisms. But it's still very important that the culture starts at the top.
Do you find that senior leaders try to hold each other accountable for their behavior?
Again, it's hard to generalize. I think that by and large and in general, I think that our culture is very collegial. And there are good things about it, there are very bad things about it. The good things is people like each other, they enjoy working with each other. Many work with each other for 20, 30 years. The bad thing about it, because of that, people are not so easily ready to criticize each other even when the mistakes are made. So there are a lot of those things that happen, but I believe that at the end of the day, people that remain and succeed in those type of levels with those types of pressures, at the end of the day, have to be truthful, have to follow, and work together. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. At the end of the day, come to think about it, there are cultural differences among companies, but they are not, unbridgeable. For example, Don and I worked for companies that were fierce competitors forever, and yet when we had people that moved from one to the other, they kind of, got used to the new cultures. They had to change, they had to adjust. But by and large, at the end of the day, what is the culture about? It's being, open-minded, being committed to excellence, and just pursue the goals. And I think that if you do that, then the rest can fall in place.
Very good. So Stephen, I'll reset the question for you. We think about the challenges of digital transformation at a high level. Is technology tougher or is culture tougher?
I agree with everything that said. I think it's really, the focus is on culture. I mean, it's about the people and the process. I think a lot's already been said in terms about company culture, so maybe I can just comment on subculture, is if I look at leading an infrastructure group, I mean, we are fundamentally asking the infrastructure people to change how they operate, who they interact with, and the skill sets they possess to be successful, to remain relevant. Definitely major cultural transformation.
Yep.
One additional comment I would make, though, on the technology is, I think the technology, it's culture first, but the technology choices that we make, especially as we introduce more and more open source, et cetera, we've got to make the right choices. And I think the comment was made earlier in terms of, okay, we can try something and we can do it quickly, and if it doesn't work, we can revert. But we're still expected at the end of the day to run industrial strength platforms.
That's right.
And those choice of
Absolutely.
technologies is very
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, and so that's a great segue, thank you, into the next part of our conversation. I want to talk a little bit about capabilities. So when you're faced with this really, we'll call it an interesting, I'll speak euphemistically, this really interesting challenge, right, of keeping an industrial size operation going while continuing to experiment forward. You know, that sounds like you need perhaps a mix of skills and mindsets that's a little bit different from the past. Is that a fair assumption? And if so, do you feel like your part of the organization has the capabilities it's going to need over the next, say, 5 years?
I think it's a mix. And does the organization or parts of the organization have the capabilities? I think for me, the answer really is, are they successfully going to make the transition or not? Are there some that want to be on the bus, and are there some that resist against that? Yes. So I think it's a combination of acquiring new talent, especially new talent that can help accelerate the transition of skills for people that want to make that transition. One of the things that we've done with a number of the technologies is introduce lunch and learns. So we take containerization or name a technology and say, okay, we've brought in some real skills from the outside, but we also want to take those people that are raising their hand and say, I want to be along the journey, let's help you with that.
And so that's a really interesting, I think, strategy. You're bringing in kind of experts in some key fields as, are they teachers? Are they Pied Pipers? Are they kind of implied threats? I'm sure it's not the latter, but like, how do you think about them?
I would say more Pied Pipers. Yeah. Interestingly enough, I think, you know, some of that new talent that we're bringing in, to maybe not politically correct, they tend to be on the younger side of things, and they seem to be extremely enthusiastic about sharing and collaborating and help others with the journey, regardless of their profile.
Yeah, very good. So Svi, I think same question. Like, how do you what's your assessment of your team's kind of capabilities today versus what you think you're going to need over the next half decade?
So I think that I agree with Steve. It's always a mix. I think that if you've been in technology for many years, then you know that technology continues to change, and the people that survive and strive are the ones that, you know, adjust and continue. It's very similar to evolution. It's not the strong that survive; it's the ones that adapt. Mm-hmm. And the people that are willing to adapt are the ones that will continue to be successful. Every time there is a new shift in technology, the initial reaction, oh my God, we're all gonna die, and it's like none of us will survive. And then we learn the new skills and we continue, and long and behold, it's still there. Every new technology that is being announced, it starts with basically this will resolve again all issues, and nobody needs to work hard anymore. We still need to work hard. Mm-hmm. And I think that the majority of the people that have been around long enough have gone through several of those cycles, several of those changes. Yeah. So when it's a new technology, then they learn it. Now, some people cannot. Some people actually even admit, they're saying, listen, I just don't want to learn a new one. I feel comfortable with what I have. I believe that the legacy will stay around for enough years before I retire. Leave me alone. I respect that. That's okay. Some people try and fail. They just cannot make the transition. Many people, you know, can make it, and it's a matter of you know, again, normally when I look at people, especially when we interview, I look at them in 3 levels. There are the skills, what are the skills that they have, what are their abilities, and what are their values. My view is skills can be learned relatively quickly. If one of your abilities is to be a quick learner, then skills can be done. Abilities are harder to change. It may take some years to acquire a new ability, and then with this you can do things. Values rarely change. You are who you are. And I think that people have the right values and have or develop or evolve the right abilities, they can change their skills much faster because the world continues to change, continues to move, and that's part of it. So I'm normally optimistic about people's ability to evolve and change and grow. Otherwise, we would still be in, running mainframes with cards.
Right. So what I hear you both saying, and I'm going to oversimplify, and so I apologize, is that it is much more will than it is skill. Is that fair? The desire to change is much more important than the current skill set. Eric, does that resonate?
Yeah, listen, I think, first of all, we're in a world that we need both sets of skills, right? There are legacy things that will be around for a long time. And I want the people who are good at those things because I've got to run an efficient, well-maintained shop, right? Then I would agree though, but there's a lot of this is around aptitude. People have adapted over the years, right? I mean, 10 years ago we weren't talking about containers. I remember when we made the transition to virtual servers, right? And that took a transition, but people figured it out. And I think there's a group that is always going to be able to do that. They will always adapt. And yes, some of them are younger, but quite frankly, some of them are older. They have the aptitude, and they want to learn, and they're adapting. I think the question is, do we have enough of them? And I think we would all probably agree that probably not, right? And it's not that we don't have enough people in our orgs, it's that the shape of things is changing so quickly. How do I now work in a world where I need to maintain what today we would call legacy, at the same time developing those capabilities for tomorrow, and at the same time working on those capabilities that are here today that are different than the legacy. And that I think is the challenge for us.
Great, thank you. So Don, I'm gonna retune the question for you a little bit, especially given your vantage point at McKinsey right now. Right, I think what you've all said, I think pretty clearly, is we've been through a lot of technology transformation before, and people have adapted and learned new skills, and I think that's quite accurate. I think it's also fair to say that the implications of new skills today are a little bit different in that technology is now driving the business rather than supporting the business. And I think that there are some new capabilities implicit in that. And I'm trying to find my way to a question here, Don. But I think what I'm asking you to do is just kind of, is to answer the same question, right? Do organizations, have the capabilities required to compete in the digital world, but to look at it in terms of technology skills, but also the required business skills?
Yeah, listen, I think that the often what I see and have seen is that the challenge is much less about people, right? That frankly, being on the right side of history, if you look at just the demographics, at Goldman, over 30% of our people were millennials. They were coming in the workforce. They wanted to do more. They were curious. And they weren't just in technology. They were in our business. They wanted to write software. They wanted to be self-empowered. So, the shift towards how do you have people that can adapt and learn and are going to be able to, take on new skills is almost embedded in the workforce that we often have. And so I think we kind of missed that fact. But the issue is, how do you actually enable people to learn and to do things and actually make things happen? And one of the things that I used to think quite a bit about when I was at Goldman was, I was in a bank. We were highly regulated. Some of the other panelists are in the same situation. So, okay, we're not allowed to go and use things unless there's, massive amounts of things we can prove that we could do no harm. We're not allowed to go in and participate in open source communities because of other, so you have this challenge where if you went back 20 years ago, people could learn these new skills at home. They could learn in other forms of avenues. In today's workforce, particularly in regulated industries, you have to go and construct opportunities for people to actually get exposure to learn these types of skills. And often many of the things we're talking about are not learn Java now, learn Python. It's learn how to think about data science and learn about mathematics. I mean, it's just they're just very different types of skills. So both the kind of the constraints that we often see in the institution you need to as a CTO, I believe a big part of the responsibility is to help kind of both create the advocacy, make the awareness that if you're not creating the opportunities for people to learn and actually have the avenues to actually gain these skills, that you're going to do long-term harm to your organization. But it's not natural. You have to go out and you have to create it. But I always make the assumption that people will always want to and will strive to and frankly will covet those type of opportunities. Again, when I look at the workforce, it was more demand-driven than trying to force people to accept change.
Yeah, thank you. So let's now move from kind of capabilities to jobs. And what I'm interested in is how your org charts, right, have changed over the past. I'm going to use these kind of 5 years. Let's look at last 5 years, right? What new jobs have been created? What jobs perhaps have disappeared? And then kind of forward 5 years, kind of how you envision the org chart changing over the next 5 years. And Don, we'll begin with you.
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. One, I think many of the more historical structures for like dedicated functions for operations and for risk management, so your SOCs, your perspective of your network command centers, they've largely been erased, and that's because of automation. Right? There are still control functions, but the control functions have become both significantly smaller in size. I remember it wasn't that long ago when we had a team at Goldman which was over 600 people to do provisioning. So when a new person entered the company, they had to get a computer, they had to get applications, they had to get privileges, and automation just removed that entirely, which is a good thing, but it obviously changes the shape of your org structure. The second thing that I would say that we definitely saw and continue to see is an evolution towards more shared types of platforms in companies, because the cost of building thousands of applications where every application is kind of like a reinvention of the wheel is just too high, both the initial cost as well as the ownership cost. So seeing a lot more of platform teams that provide internal services that are modeled to be kind of like your own AWS or your own view of the Google Cloud. That I think that's important, and I think it's helping with innovation where it's being done.
Eric, let's talk about Cigna's org chart.
Yeah, I think again we've seen the same thing, which is automation has, I wouldn't say eliminated positions, but it's changed the shape of what people do. The other thing is, in our organization, is migrating more towards this services mindset, because you come in and people are very siloed. I'm a storage person, I'm a compute person, I'm a network person, and saying our users don't consume in that manner, right? That's an internal construct. It doesn't work anywhere outside of IT. So start thinking about things in terms of how are these things being consumed, and they're consumed in ways that are called services, and start thinking of yourself as the owner of that service, as the CEO of your service, and how do you want to operate. Now, we haven't completely made that transition, but it changes how people behave, and it changes the linkages then between, well, you don't operate in a silo anymore. But as far as positions being eliminated, I think we see a lot more data scientists. We see a lot more around loosely called big data, and we see a lot more around automation. And automation is less about how much do you know about a deep domain, and more about how much can you learn across domains so that we can stitch this stuff together.
Yeah. So Zvi, we'll come to you. I mean, same question, and if there are jobs as we think forward, if there are jobs that you're thinking about kind of creating or that perhaps don't exist yet, I'd be really interested in that as well.
So we'll start with the change. I mean, I totally agree with what Don and Eric said. I think that those are really the major changes, more data scientists, more people in AI and machine learning, a lot of effort on agile DevOps type of activities going forward, a lot of X as a service. Those are the things that will be there. There are several jobs that have shrunk dramatically due to the automation, due to the changes. Some of them will still stay for a long time. In 1982, there was the main article in Computer World. The title was "The Mainframe is Dead." We just learned that about 4 years ago, unfortunately, the person that wrote the article passed away. The mainframe is still alive. So those are, okay, fine. I came to the realization that after my retirement, the mainframe was still going to be there. So some things will stay, but they're not going to be the same as they were before. I think that again, the changes in the organization are noticeable, and mainly in the last 3 to 4 years, more than before. Buzzwords change all the time. Every time there is a new buzzword. I think that you're right, about 3 to 4 years ago, everything was big data, no matter what it was. Yeah. I mean, it could be a new storage device, it's big data. Now it's no longer big data, now it's all AI machine learning. So it's the same product, by the way, it's just different. So for this is noise. That doesn't make a difference. The real difference is really in the ability to continue to evolve the way we work and change the way we work. And that's something that I see changing. Again, the move more to services is real. We have talked for ages about being close to the business and working with them. We are now experimenting, finally working together with them in agile squads, etc. And it's not easy. It's not easy because they are used to, while the business always said we want to be part of the decision making and the progress, when you say, wonderful, join the squad, be there every other day, be in the sprints. No. I mean, we are busy. We have our work to do. You guys do what you need to do. When it's ready, we'll take a look. And that's waterfall. That's not agile. We trust you. This change, this is a cultural change that needs to happen not just within IT, but also within the business. So to answer your question is to the future, I mean, nobody can predict what the future will be like, but I do agree that there will be a continuous growth in data science. I think that, but this is real data science. It's not DBAs that changed the profile in LinkedIn to now be data scientist. Okay, that's not exactly the same. Okay, this is also not people that learn statistics and finally found out, wow, statistics is now in fashion, now I'm a data scientist. No, it's a real new practice that you need to learn. So I definitely see more growth in there. I definitely see a decline in a traditional project management practice as such, a decline in business management and business analysis as such, and an increase of more, less people that are liaisons, more people that are more, I would say, deep and wide technically. The full stack engineer sounds great. In some cases, and maybe for smaller companies and very confined ones, it's doable. For large and complex environment, it's a little hard. If you're a developer, I rather that you don't touch my switches. Really, don't touch the switches. But I think that many of those things will continue to go into this direction. SREs will be up in the rise, will be other mechanisms and ways of doing so. I think that there will be an evolution there as well.
Very good. So, Stephen, as at least the appearance, right, of AI, machine learning, cognitive technologies is that these are more complex technologies. Let's call, or at least differently complex technologies, where we are going to need kind of deep specialists to build models. I think there's also a risk that there's going to be a widening gap, because the gap certainly already exists between the understanding of technology executives and non-technology executives. And some people have suggested that there's going to be this kind of form of translator that organizations are going to require. Does that resonate with you at all?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, I actually see the gap closing between the technologist and the business. I think one point, and again, I think when you talk about machine learning, AI, et cetera, a lot of what's behind that is the data scientists, right? And it's all about the data, right? At the end of the day, some of this is, and I don't want to simplify it too much, but it's algorithms against that data. Yeah. One point I'd like to make, though, and I think Eric made in his previous presentation, is for me, in terms of the organization, when you start to talk about Chief Digital Officer, CTO, CIO, Chief Data Officer, Head of IT Risk, Compliance, Legal, it's all about the governance. Now, I think, what's the future going to look like? Are some of those roles going to morph? Are some of those titles going to go away? I don't know, but I think if the governance is not there, then it fails.
And, I mean, do you think that that's real risk? In other words, do you feel like a lot of organizations aren't thinking about governance the right way right now?
I think I'll use a theoretical example. I think if you have an organization set up where the CDO is reporting to one part of the organization, the CIO, CTO, another part of the organization, and so on and so forth, that needs to be addressed.
Okay, very good. So you mentioned, this is perfect transition at the outset, that among the things keeping you up at night, cybersecurity was top of mind. So let's talk about kind of where we are with cybersecurity today. What are you doing today that you weren't doing, say, 12 months ago? Or what threat are you looking at today that you weren't looking at 12 months ago?
I think the list is long. I mean, I think if you look at the role of the IT security, first of all, I don't think IT security is really just a segmented group anymore. Right?
That's right.
Number two is, at the end of the day, it used to be we're protecting the perimeter, right? That's changed completely. So, where I see the change, I think the IT security function now needs to be embedded. Back when we talked about DevOps, et cetera, it really needs to be embedded in the whole chain, right? And one thing that I see that's happened a lot more, even over the past 12 months, is IT security as part of the application development mindset.
Yeah. So are you using scenario planning? Is that even a feasible thing to do anymore?
We've actually done tabletop exercises where we come up with a scenario and we go back to the board, actually, with the analysis, some recommendations, and we actually reach a conclusion. Obviously in a hypothetical situation, but we make it actually, the last we did was something that really was affecting the front office, and we needed to make a decision, can we accept the risk till the end of the day, or do we need to do something more preemptive?
Yeah. Svi, same question.
So there are several things. First of all, I agree with Steve that the belief that we had a few years ago that as long as you protect the perimeter, you're in good shape, has changed. We assume that one way or another it will be breached, so we take an approach of protect, detect, and recover. So the assumption is there will be something to be detected. The actors have changed and evolved as well. In the past, I mean, we know how to deal with DDoS, okay, fine. In the past, we were able to identify, malware and others by a set of smart honeypots that will identify if a server is pinging the wrong way and so on. But as we got more complicated, so did adversarials as well. And now we're dealing with state-based attacks and technology after the leak from the NSA, et cetera. We have seen a significant increase in the complexity of the attacks. So now we are employing machine learning and other mechanisms to identify algorithms like needle in a haystack or in other types of anomaly detection. We also deployed a purple team, which is red and blue. Well, the reds are trying to attack us and the blue are trying to defend us. So we are trying to continue to evolve, and this is an arms race. And unfortunately, we are the few and the other side are the many. I also agree with Steve that in the development environment that used to be totally oblivious to security, because that's those guys' problem, I'm just a developer, is changing. Adding to DevOps was this DevSecOps. Yep. Was a very important part of it in our shop today. No matter how you do your development, the moment that you post your code, we automatically do static code analysis right in place, and you never know about it. When you package it and you do your CI and part of it, and we do the dynamic code analysis. When you go to runtime, we do that as well. We do a lot of other guardrails and checks along the way. Both to protect against insider threat, but also realistically against honest mistakes. And so that becomes more and more embedded within the application SDLC, and that's part of the changes. So the world of security is changing both from a as cybersecurity per se, as well as from the development side. And the third leg of it is, which is the risk, and the way we look at risk, and what is, basically at the end of the day, you cannot, let's face it, the most secure transaction is the ones that you don't do. We can create such a security around our transactions that you cannot do anything.
Yep.
Which is great from a security point of view. The business may not be so happy. So we need to be more agile in this sense and more open-minded, and that's a balance that we are all facing.
Very good, thank you. So I'm going to shift for our last, 30 seconds, but let's call it a minute, to one more topic I wanted to touch on really quickly, Eric and Don, and that's the rise of the digital consumer, right? And this prevailing theory that we no longer differentiate with respect to our expectations between a consumer experience and an industrial experience. If I have a great experience with Apple, I expect it from Cigna. I expect it from any client you're working with at McKinsey. Do you buy that? And if so, what are the implications, really quickly?
Do I buy it? Yeah, I think we live it every day. The bar has been set high by not just Apple, but others around, whether it's what I'm bringing into the workplace or the experience I have. The implication is we need to change how we even approach solving the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Fundamentally, it's a shift from how we dealt with things before to we now have to deal with it in a much more dynamic environment, and it's hard.
Yeah, very good. Don,
Yeah,
last
no,
word.
I completely agree, and I think that what's really important to recognize is it's not just a consumer landscape issue, right? That institutions are made up of people too, and so if you're Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or whomever, and you're dealing with other companies, that it's the people in that company that either like your products or they don't like your products, and so it's the same problem and it's the same demographic structure. But yeah, I think people have lived for a while thinking that's a consumer issue, and it's not for us in the institutional space, but it is.
Yeah, and a conversation to be continued another day. So Don, Eric, Zvi, Stephen, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.